26. Heraclea was also a daughter of Hiero. She was the wife of Zopus, who had been sent by Hieronymus as an ambassador to King Ptolemy, and had decided on voluntary exile for himself. When Heraclea learned in advance that men were coming for her too, she took her 2 unmarried daughters with her and sought refuge in a shrine before her tutelary gods, her hair disheveled and her appearance generally pitiful. She further added her entreaties invoking the gods one moment and the memory of her father Hiero and brother Galo the next. She was innocent, she declared, and the men should not let her burn in flames of hatred felt for Hieronymus. She had gained nothing but her husband's exile from Hieronymus's reign. She had not enjoyed the same fortune as her sister in Hieronymus's lifetime, and her case was not the same as hers now that he was dead, either. If Andronodoros' plans had come off, she said, then her sister would have shared the rule with her husband, and she, like everyone else, would have had to obey them. If someone should report to Zopus that Hieronymus had been killed and Syracuse liberated, she added, it was perfectly clear that she would immediately board ship and return home. "How human hopes are frustrated!" she exclaimed. Zopus' native land had now been liberated, and yet within it his wife and children were fighting for their lives. And what kind of obstruction to liberty and the rule of law were they? What risk was she to anyone, a woman alone and virtually a widow of her girls, who were living as orphans? But perhaps it would be said that, while there was no danger to be feared from her, the line of the tyrants was nevertheless hated. In that case, she said, she should banish her and her daughters far from Syracuse and Sicily, order them transported to Alexandria, the wife to her husband, the daughters to their father. Ears and hearts were turned from her. The men shouted to her not to waste their time, and she saw some of them drawing their swords. She gave up entreaties for herself and started begging them at least to spare the girls. They were of an age even a furious enemy would not touch, she said, and in taking their revenge on tyrants, they should not repeat the crimes they themselves found abominable. As she said this, they dragged her from the sanctuary and slit her throat. They then turned on the girls, now spattered with their mother's blood. Hysterical with grief and terror, the girls dashed from the shrine as though gripped by frenzy, and with such speed that, had it been possible for them to get out into the street, they would have raised pandemonium throughout the city. Even as it was, within the narrow confines of the house and with armed men all around, they more than once escaped unharmed, and despite contending with hands so many and so strong, tore themselves from the assassin's clutches. Finally, exhausted from wounds and having covered everything with their blood, they fell lifeless to the ground. The killing was tragic in itself, but was rendered more tragic by the arrival of a message, shortly afterwards, cancelling the execution. There had been a sudden change of heart and softening of feelings. Then, after pity, came anger over their haste to inflict punishment, without leaving themselves any leeway to reconsider or let passions cool. And so the crowd grumbled and demanded an election to replace Andronodoros and Themistocles, for both had been praetors, an election that was certainly not going to be to the praetors' liking. 27. An election day was scheduled. On that day, to everyone's surprise, one individual right at the back of the crowd nominated Epicides, and then another nominated Hippocrates. After that, voices supporting these men increased, clearly with the approval of the crowd. The gathering was, in fact, made up of diverse elements, comprising not only citizens but soldiers as well, many of them deserters with an agenda for radical change. The praetors at first pretended not to notice, and tried to drag out the proceedings, but finally, overwhelmed by the solidarity of feeling and fearing a riot, they declared the two men praetors. The two did not disclose their intentions as soon as they were elected, unhappy though they were with that delegates had gone to Appius Claudius to request a 10-day truce, and that, when the truce was granted, others had been sent to discuss renewing the old treaty. At the time, the Romans had a fleet of 100 vessels of Mergantia, and there they waited to see how the unrest in Syracuse, following the assassination of the ruling family, would turn out, and where the people would be taken by their new and unfamiliar freedom. In the meantime, the Syracusan delegates had been sent on to Marcellus on his landing in Sicily by Appius. After hearing their peace proposals, Marcellus felt some agreement was possible, and he dispatched his own delegates to Syracuse to discuss the renewal of the treaty face to face with the praetors. And by this time there was nothing like the earlier calm and tranquility in the city. A report of the arrival of the Carthaginian fleet off Pacinum relieved Hippocrates and Epicides of their fears. And they had been making allegations to the mercenaries and then the deserters that Syracuse was being betrayed to the Romans. And indeed, when Appius began to keep some ships stationed at the harbor mouth in order to raise the morale of the supporters of the faction he favored, these groundless charges had apparently been given weighty corroboration. At first, in fact, a crowd had rushed wildly down to the shore to check the Romans if they tried to land. 28. In the midst of this chaos, it was decided that a popular assembly should be held. There was some difference of opinion, and a riot was imminent. Then one of the leading citizens, Apollonides, made what was, in the circumstances, a salutary address. No state, he said, had ever come close either to realizing its hope for security or to being destroyed. For he explained, if there were all in agreement in favoring either the Romans or the Carthaginians, then no state would be in a more fortunate or favorable position. If, however, they pulled in different directions, then the war between Carthage and Rome would be no more bloody than the war the Syracusans would fight amongst themselves, since, in this war, each side would have its own armies, its own weapons, and its own commanders. Within the very same walls, accordingly, said Apollonides, they must do their utmost to achieve unanimity, the issue of which alliance was more advantageous to them was secondary, and of much less significance. However, he added, in choosing allies, one would do better to follow the judgment of Hiero rather than that of Hieronymus, or rather to prefer a friendship with which they had been happy over 50 years to one that was now unfamiliar to them, and which in the past had been unreliable. There was also another factor of some importance to their deliberations, he said. The Carthaginians would be refused a peace treaty without that necessarily entailing immediate war with them. With the Romans, they must immediately have either war or peace. The speech carried all the more weight for its apparent lack of self-interest and partisanship. The praetors and a select body of senators were joined by a committee of military advisers, and the commanders of army units and prefects of the auxiliaries were also instructed to take part in their discussions. The issue was frequently and hotly debated. As it became clear that there was no way in which they could conduct a war against the Romans, they finally decided that peace should be made with them, and that an embassy be sent to conclude it. (29) Not many days passed before ambassadors from Leontini came with a plea for help in defending their territory, and this embassy seemed to provide a welcome opportunity to unburden the city of a crowd of unruly subversives and remove their leaders. The praetor Hippocrates was instructed to take the deserters to Leontini, and a large contingent of mercenary auxiliaries went with them, bringing a number of soldiers to 4,000. Those doing the sending and those being sent were both well pleased with the mission, one group having been granted its long-desired opportunity of fomenting revolution, and the other being delighted with the siphoning off of what it perceived as the scum of the city. But it was only temporary relief that they brought to this sick body, which would soon relapse into a more severe disease. This was because Hippocrates began to plunder lands lying next to the area of Roman control. He did so with stealthy raids at first, but later, when military aid was sent by Appius to defend the fields of the Roman allies, he launched a full-scale attack on a guard post that opposed him, causing heavy casualties. When this was reported to Marcellus, he immediately sent delegates to Syracuse to say that the peace guaranteed by the Syracusans had been broken, and that a motive for war would never be lacking unless Hippocrates and Epicides were sent far away, not just from Syracuse, but from the whole of Sicily. Epicides feared that, while he remained in Syracuse, he might be charged with his absent brother's crime, or that he might fail there to do his part in fomenting the war, and so he, too, left for Leontini. He could see that the citizens of Leontini were already sufficiently incensed with the Roman people, and he began trying to detach them from the Syracusans as well. The basis of the peace treaty that the Syracusans had struck with the Romans, he told them, was that the peoples formerly ruled by the tyrants would now also be under Syracusan authority. The Syracusans were no longer satisfied with their own freedom unless they also had power to and dominion over others, he said. So they should be formally notified that the people of Leontini felt that they, too, should be free, whether because it was on the soil of their city that the tyrant was killed, or because it was there that the call for liberty first went up, when people deserted the tyrant's captains and came running to Syracuse. And so, concluded Epicides, that clause had to be removed from the treaty, or else the people of Leontini should reject a treaty that was so worded. The masses were easily persuaded, and when the Syracusan delegates protested over the killing of the Roman guards, and demanded that Hippocrates and Epicides leave for Leucre, or for any other location more to their liking, provided they left Sicily, they received a truculent reply. They had not entrusted to the Syracusans the responsibility of making peace with the Romans on their behalf. The people of Leontini told them, and they were not bound by treaties that others had made. The Syracusans reported this to the Romans, adding that Leontini was not under their control. Accordingly, they said the Romans could go to war with that city without breaking their treaty with Syracuse, and that the Syracusans would not stay out of the war, either provided that the people of Leontini became subject to them once more when they were defeated, as the peace treaty provided. 30. Marcellus set out for Leontini with his entire army, summoning Appius to attack the town from the other direction. Such was the fervor that he found in his men, who were incensed at the killing of the guards during peace negotiations, that they took the city at the first assault. When Hippocrates and Epicides saw the walls being taken and the gates smashed in, they retreated to the citadel with a few men, and then secretly made their escape to Herbesus under cover of night. The Syracusans had now left home in a column of 8,000 men, and at the river Myles a messenger met them with the news of the city's capture. The rest of the report, however, was a tissue of lies containing strands of truth. There had been an indiscriminate massacre of soldiers and townspeople, said the messenger, and he thought no adult had survived, and the town had been sacked, the property of the wealthy being given to the troops. The appalling news brought the column to a halt. There was alarm throughout the ranks, and the leaders, they were Sosus and Diomenes, discussed what reaction they should take. The fact that deserters, some 2,000 men, had been flogged and decapitated bolstered the lies, adding plausible grounds for fear. In fact, however, none of the people of Leontini and none of the other soldiers had been harmed after the city was captured, and property had been returned in full, apart from what was lost in the initial chaos immediately following the capture. The Syracusan soldiers protested that their comrades had been betrayed and put to death, and they could not be constrained either to continue to Leontini or to wait on the spot for more reliable information. The praetors could see they were verging on mutiny, but saw, too, that the agitation would be short-lived if the men responsible for such idiocy were removed, and so they led the army to Megara. They then set off themselves to Herbesus, with a few cavalrymen, hoping that, in the general panic, they could take possession of the town through treachery. This proved a fruitless undertaking, and they felt they should use force. The following day they moved camp from Megara, intending to mount an all-out attack on Herbesus. Hippocrates and Epicides now decided to put themselves in the hands of their soldiers, who, for the most part, knew them well and were, at that moment, incensed over the report of the massacre of their comrades. At first sight, this course did not seem very safe, but with hopes dashed on every side, they thought it was the only one possible, and so they went out to meet the column. As it happened, at the head of the column were 600 Cretans, who had served under 2 men in Hieronymus's army, and who were obliged to Hannibal for releasing them after they were taken prisoner, along with other Roman auxiliary troops at Trasimene. When Hippocrates and Apicides recognized them by their standards and the style of their armor, they held out olive branches and other symbols of supplication, begging them to receive and protect them, and not surrender them to the Syracusans. For they said the latter would soon deliver them to the Roman people to be put to the sword. 31. The Cretans, in fact, loudly encouraged them to take heart. They would share with them whatever fortune had in store, they said. During this exchange, the standards had come to a halt, and the column was held up. But the reason for the delay had not yet reached the commanders. Word then spread through the ranks that Hippocrates and Apicides were there, and there was a buzz of evident approval over their arrival throughout the column, prompting the praetors to gallop immediately to the head of the line. What sort of conduct was this, they asked? What was this slipshod behavior of the Cretans? Engaging the enemy in conversation and bringing them into the column without an order from their praetors. They then ordered Hippocrates arrested and clapped in irons. When the order was given, there was such a deafening outcry, initially from the Cretans, but then taken up by others, that it was quite clear that if the praetors took the matter any further, they would have to fear for their own safety. Perturbed and unsure how to handle the situation, they ordered a withdrawal to Megara, their point of departure, and sent messengers to Syracuse to report their current plight. At this moment, when everything was regarded with suspicion, Hippocrates also came up with a piece of trickery. He sent a number of Cretans to keep watch on the roads and then read out a letter that he claimed to have intercepted, but which was really his own composition, headed from the praetors of Syracuse to the consul Marcellus. It declared, after the formula of salutation, that the consul's action in sparing nobody in Leontini had been right and proper, but the letter continued. The case was the same for all the mercenary troops, and there would never be peace in Syracuse as long as any foreign auxiliaries remained in either the city or the army. Marcellus should therefore take steps to bring under his authority the men encamped with the praetors at Megara, and he should free Syracuse once and for all by executing them. After the letter was read out, there was a rush to arms with such an uproar that the praetors, panic-stricken, took advantage of the confusion and rode off to Syracuse. Even their flight failed to stem the mutiny. However, the attacks began to be made on the Syracusan soldiers, none of whom would have been spared had not Apicides and Hippocrates stood up to the furious mob. Not that they felt any compassion or pity for them, it was simply not to curtail their own hopes of return, for they could gain the soldiers' loyalty while they also kept them as hostages, and they could furthermore secure the support of their relatives and friends, first by the service they had rendered, and then by using the men as security. Experience had also shown them how the crowd could be swayed by a breeze ever so slight and insubstantial. They therefore acquired the services of one of the soldiers who had been under siege at Leontini, and bribed him to take to Syracuse information consistent with the false reports made at the river Mylaeus. The aim was for the man to stir the people to fury by presenting himself as an authority on the incident, and giving an account of the unsubstantiated events as if he were an eyewitness. The The fellow not only gained credence with the common people, but when he was brought into the Senate House, he also impressed the senators. Some men who were not without influence openly proclaimed that it was just as well that the greed and brutality of the Romans had been brought to light at Leontini. They should have done the same, or even worse, had they entered Syracuse, the reward for their avarice being so much the greater there. The result was that the Syracusans voted unanimously to close their gates and put the city on a defensive footing. However, the fears and animosities of the Syracusans were not only centered on the same people. In the case of all the soldiers and most of the commons, their hostilities centered on the Romans, but the praetors and a few of the nobility, excited though they were by the fraudulent report, were more wary of the closer and more immediate threat. And in fact, Hippocrates and Epicides were already at the Hexapylon. There, by means of relatives of citizens who were in the army, they were initiating discussions in which they urged the people to throw open the gates to them, and to allow the country, which they shared, to be defended against a Roman attack. One of the gates of the Hexapylon had actually been opened, and men had begun to let in when the praetors arrived on the scene. They tried to stop this, first by orders and threats, and then by using their personal authority. When all their attempts failed, they finally forgot their dignity and pleaded with the people not to betray their native land to men who were former henchmen of the tyrant, and who were now corrupting the army. But the crowd had been stirred up, and their ears were deaf to all this, and the doors were being battered as violently on the inside as on the outside. When all of them were broken down, the army was let in at all points of the Hexapylon. The praetors sought refuge with the younger members of the population in Acradina, and the mercenaries, deserters, and all the tyrant's soldiers left in Syracuse swelled the numbers of the enemy. So it was that Acradina was taken at the first assault, and all the praetors, apart from those who slipped away during the turmoil, were put to death. Nightfall brought an end to the killing. The next day, slaves were invited to assume the cap of freedom, and convicts were released from prison. This motley crowd of people unanimously elected Hippocrates and Epicides praetors, and after a fleeting gleam of liberty, Syracuse had relapsed into its servitude of old. (33) When this was reported to the Romans, the camp was promptly moved to Leontini to Syracuse. Also, it so happened that some emissaries had been sent through the harbor in a quinquerem by Appius. A quadrireman that had been sent ahead of them was captured when it entered the harbor mouth, and the emissaries had a narrow escape. So by now, not even the rules of peace, much less those of war, had been left inviolate, and at this point the Roman army pitched camp a mile and a half from the city at the Olympian, a temple of Jupiter. It was decided that envoys should be sent from there, but to prevent them entering the city, Hippocrates and Epicides came to meet them outside the gate with their supporters. The spokesman for the Romans said it was not war but support and aid, and they were bringing to the Syracusans, both to those who had sought refuge with his people after escaping from the midst of the carnage, and to those who from fear were enduring a servitude worse than exile, worse even than death. The Romans would not, he said, allow the barbaric slaughter of their allies to go unpunished. So if those who had sought refuge with the Romans were granted a safe return home, if those responsible for the slaughter were surrendered, and if the Syracusans had their freedom and constitution restored to them, there was no need for war. But if these conditions were not met, he warned, the Romans would open hostilities against any who opposed them. Epicides replied that if the envoy's demands had been addressed to him and his colleague, they would have had to answer for them. Now they should come back at a time when the people to whom they had who had actually come were in power in Syracuse. If the Romans opened hostilities, he added, they would discover from the results that attacking Syracuse was not at all the same as attacking Leontini. With that, Epicides left the envoys and closed the gates. After that, Syracuse came under attack on land and by sea simultaneously, on land at the Hexapylon and by sea at Acradina, the way of which is at the water's edge. The Romans had taken Leontini by the panic they inspired with their first assault, and so they were now quite confident that they would find some way of breaking into a vast city that sprawled over a wide area. They therefore moved up to the walls all the machinery they had for conducting assaults on cities. 34. In fact, an operation that commenced with such vigor would have been successful but for the presence in Syracuse at that time of one man. This was Archimedes. A peerless observer of the sky and heavenly bodies, he was an even greater marvel when it came to inventing and constructing artillery and war engines with which he would, with very little effort, frustrate any large-scale enemy operation. The city wall ran over rising terrain of uneven elevation, with sections that were high and difficult to access, but with others, too, that were low and approachable from the flat ground in the depressions. These Archimedes furnished with all manner of artillery as he thought appropriate to each location. With 60 quinquiremes, Marcellus proceeded with an assault on the wall of Acradina, which was, as observed above, stands at the water's edge. The ships were, for the most part, manned with archers and slingers, and even with skirmishers equipped with javelins, difficult for any lacking the proper experience to throw back, and these men made sure that hardly anyone could stand on the wall without receiving a wound, because they needed space for their missiles to be effective, and crews kept the vessels at a distance from the wall. The remaining quinquiremes were lashed in pairs, and the inner rows of oars were removed so that the sides of the vessels were touching, and they could be rowed along like a single ship by the outer banks of the oars. They carried towers that were built up in stories, and other apparatus for pounding the walls. To meet this armada, Archimedes deployed along the walls catapults of varying dimensions. Against ships in the distance, he would launch rocks of massive proportions, but at the closer ones he would aim projectiles that were light, and therefore able to be shot with greater frequency. Finally, to give his own soldiers protection as they showered weapons on the enemy, he pierced the wall from bottom to top with numerous slits, about a cubit long, through which they would target the enemy without being seen, some shooting arrows, and others using small scorpions. Some ships came in closer, so as to be beneath the range of the artillery. To combat these, Archimedes had a swing beam projecting over the wall, and from it a grappling hook attached to a sturdy chain would be dropped onto the prow of the ship. The beam would then be brought to the ground by a heavy lead counterweight, standing the ship on its stern by raising its prow in the air. Then, suddenly released, it would send the ship crashing down into the water, as though it were actually falling from the wall. This caused sheer panic amongst the crew, and it fell with such force that even coming down upright, it still shipped a considerable amount of water. In this way, the sea offensive was foiled, and all hope was now focused instead on a full-scale attack by land. But on that front, too, thanks to Hiero's expenditure and vigilance over many years, and thanks to Archimedes' incomparable engineering, a whole panoply of catapults had been deployed. The natural features of the location also helped. The rocky outcrop on which the wall's foundations had been set was, for the most part, so sheer that not only missiles from a catapult, but even objects rolling under their own weight came crashing down heavily on the enemy. The same factor made approaching the wall difficult and the men's footing unsteady. The Romans therefore held a meeting, and it was decided that, since they were foiled at every turn, they should abandon the direct offensive and limit themselves to a blockade to cut the enemy off from supplies by land and sea. 35. In the meantime, Marcellus set out with about a third of his army to recover the cities which, in the general upheaval, had defected to the Carthaginians. Halorus and Herbaceus he recovered when the population surrendered, but Megara he took by armed force, and then destroyed and pillaged it to inspire terror in the other cities, especially Syracuse. Hamilco had long been keeping his fleet at anchor off the promontory of Picenium, and at about this time he disembarked at Heraclea, also called Minoa. 25,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and 12 elephants. In fact, the troops with which he had earlier held his fleet at Picenium were far fewer. After the seizure of Syracuse by Hippocrates, however, Hamilco had left for Carthage, where he had been supported by ambassadors from Hippocrates, and also by a letter from Hannibal, who asserted that the time had arrived for a glorious venture to recover Sicily. And being there, in person, an adviser not without influence, he had easily convinced the Carthaginians to ship to Sicily as strong a force of infantry and cavalry as they possibly could. Within days of his arrival at Heraclea, Hamilco retook Agrigentum, and he also inspired other states supporting Carthage to hopes of driving the Romans from Sicily that eventually even those under siege in Syracuse took heart. In fact, the Syracusans now felt that the defense of their city required only a part of their troops, and they divided military duties. Epicides was to take charge of the city's protection, and Hippocrates was to join Hamilco in operations against the Roman consul. Hippocrates set off at night with 10,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, choosing a path through spots free of Roman sentries, and proceeded to pitch his camp in the environs of Aquileia. While the men were digging in, Marcellus stumbled on them on his way from Agrigentum, which was now in enemy hands. Marcellus had failed to beat the enemy in the race for Agrigentum, and he was now on his way back, expecting least of all to encounter a Syracusan army at that time and in that location. However, his fear of Hamilco and the Carthaginians, for whom he was certainly no match with the forces that he had, meant that he was However, his fear of Hamilco and the Carthaginians, for whom he was certainly no match with the forces that he had, meant that he was advancing with all possible caution, and with his column arranged so as to meet any eventuality. The precautions taken for meeting the Carthaginians now proved effective against the Sicilians. Finding them disordered and out of formation, as they established their camp, most of them without their weapons, Marcellus surrounded their entire infantry force, though the cavalry, after a slight skirmish, fled to Acre with Hippocrates. With that battle, Marcellus kept in line the Sicilians who were defecting from the Romans, and he now returned to Syracuse. A few days later, Hamilco joined up with Hippocrates and pitched camp at the river Anapus, about 8 miles distant from the city. In this same period, 55 Carthaginian warships under Bomilcar, admiral of the fleet, happened to sail from the open sea into the great harbor of Syracuse, while a Roman fleet of 30 quinquiremes also put ashore the first legion at Panormus. One might well have thought that the theatre of war had shifted from Italy, so focused on Sicily were the two peoples. Hamilco believed that the Roman legion that had been landed at Panormus and was now en route for Syracuse would certainly fall to him as a prize, but he was cheated out of it by the route he took. The Carthaginian led his men along an inland path, whereas the Roman legion, with the fleet escorting it, came through the coastal areas to Appius Claudius, who had advanced to Picenum with some of his troops in order to meet it. The Carthaginians now waited no longer at Syracuse. Bomilcar had little confidence in his navy, for the Romans possessed a fleet that was twice the size of his, and at the same time he was aware that the only outcome of his pointless delay was seeing his allies. Shortage of provisions aggravated by his men's presence. He therefore put to sea and crossed to Africa. As for Hamilco, he had wasted his time following Marcellus to Syracuse in the hope of engaging him before the Roman could be joined by larger forces. The hope had not materialized, and he could see that his enemy, well fortified and numerically strong, was safely ensconced around Syracuse. And so, not to fritter away time uselessly sitting there and watching the blockade of his allies, Hamilco struck camp. His plan was to bring his army to whatever areas the prospect of defections from the Roman might call him, and there, by his presence, raise the spirits of those espousing his cause. Brigantia was the town that he first recovered, the Roman garrison betrayed by the townspeople, and here large quantities of grain and all manner of provisions had been stockpiled for the use of the Romans. 37. This defection also gave encouragement to other city-states, and Roman garrisons now began to be expelled from the citadels or crushed after being treacherously betrayed. Henna, however, enjoyed an impregnable position, located as it was on a high bluff sheer on the sides. It also had a strong garrison in its citadel, and a garrison commander by no means susceptible to duplicity. This was Lucius Pinarius. He was an intrepid soldier, and a man who would rely more on making betrayal impossible than he would on the loyalty of the Sicilians. Furthermore, at that particular time, Pinarius had been prompted to take every possible precaution by the news of all the treacherous defections in the various cities and the annihilation of their garrisons. And so, day and night alike, everything was prepared and ready, with guards and sentries in position, and no soldier setting down his arms or quitting his post. Now the leading citizens of Henna had already made a pact with Hamilco to betray the garrison, but when they became aware of the situation and saw the Roman was leaving no room for treachery, they thought they had to act openly. They declared that the city and its citadel should be in their hands. If they had entered an alliance with the Romans as free men, and had not simply been delivered to them for imprisonment like slaves. They then voiced the opinion that it was only fair for the keys of the city to be returned to them. The strongest bond between good allies was mutual trust, they said, and the only way the people of Henna could have the gratitude of the Roman people and the Senate would be by remaining on terms of friendship with them of their own volition, and not under duress. The Roman's answer to this was that he had been installed in his position by his commanding officer, from whom he had also received the keys of the gates and the task of defending the citadel. It was not by his own authority, or that of the people of Henna, that he held these responsibilities, he said, but by the authority of the man who had put them in his hands. Leaving one's post was a capital offense for Romans, Pinarius continued, and fathers had even put their own children to death in punishment for such an act. The consul Marcellus was not far off, he said, in conclusion, and they should send a delegation to him, since he had the right and authority to decide on the matter. The people of Henna replied that they would certainly not do that, and declared that if talk got them nowhere, they would seek some way of asserting their liberty. Pinarius then said that if they objected to a deputation to the consul, he himself should be admitted to their popular assembly, so he could ascertain whether the declaration they were making came from a few or from the entire citizen body. It was agreed that an assembly be called the following day. 38. Leaving that meeting, Pinarius went back to the citadel. He brought his soldiers together and said, I think you have heard, men, of how Roman garrisons have been set upon and overpowered by Sicilians in recent days. Such treachery you have avoided, first of all thanks to the goodwill of heaven, and then thanks to your own courage, standing vigilantly on guard, day and night, under arms. I only wish that the rest of our time here could be passed without our suffering or initiating barbaric acts. The precautions we have so far taken have worked in the case of covert treachery. Since treachery has achieved little success, there is now a clear and explicit demand being made for the keys to the city gates. The moment we surrender these, Henna will immediately be in the hands of the Carthaginians, and we shall be butchered here with greater savagery than that with which the garrison at Morgantia was murdered. I have only with difficulty managed to gain this one night for a discussion in which to inform you of the peril that lies ahead. At dawn they are going to hold an assembly. At this, their purpose is to incriminate me and incite the populace against you. As a result, Hannah will tomorrow run either with your blood or with the blood of its people. Preempted by them, you will have no hope. Anticipate them, and you will face no danger. Victory will go to the man who first draws the sword, so you must all await the signal, alert and under arms. As for me, I shall be at the assembly, and there I shall spin out the time with talk and argumentation until it is all prepared. When I give the signal, by moving my toga, I want you at that point to raise a cry in every quarter, fall on the crowd, and bring down everything with your swords. See to it that nothing survives whose brute force or treachery could possibly be cause for fear in future. I pray to you, Mother Ceres and Proserpina, and all the other deities, above and beneath the earth, who dwell in this city and these holy lakes and groves, help us with your favor and goodwill, if truly we have adopted such a plan only to avoid and not ourselves commit a treacherous act. I would address you with a longer speech of encouragement, men, were the fight ahead with an armed foe. They are unarmed and unprepared, and you will slaughter them till you tire of it. And to relieve you of any possible fear with regard to Himilco and the Carthaginians, the consul's camp is in the vicinity. 39. Following this exhortation, the men were sent off to take food and rest. The next day they were assigned to various locations for blockading roads and shutting off escape routes. Most of them, since they had also in the past been regular observers of the assemblies, took up positions above and around the theatre. The Roman commander was introduced to the people by the magistrates. He declared that it was the consul, not he, who had jurisdiction and authority in the matter, and then added much the same remarks as he had made the day before. At first there were only hesitant calls from a section of the crowd for the surrender of the keys, but soon they were all clamoring with a single voice. When Pinarius became hesitant and evasive, they burst into fierce threats, and were evidently not going to refrain any longer from extremes of violence. At that point the commander gave a pre-arranged signal with his toga. His soldiers, who had for some time been ready and waiting for action, then raised the shout, and came rushing down upon the rear of the assembly from the higher ground, while others massed together and blocked the exits from the theatre. Enclosed in the seating area, the people of Henna faced a massacre. The piles of bodies grew not just from the killing, but also from the stampede, as they charged down over each other's heads and ended in heaps, the uninjured falling on the wounded, the living on the dead. Then the Romans took off in all directions, and the entire scene was one of flight and panic, as in a city taken by storm, and the fact that they were butchering an unarmed crowd did not diminish the fury of the soldiers. Danger shared by both sides, and the heat of battle, would not have excited them more. Henna was thus retained by an act that was heinous or necessary. Marcellus did not object to what had happened, and in fact ceded the spoils of Henna to the rank and file. He believed that the Sicilians would in future be deterred by fear from betraying the garrisons. However, this was a city in the heart of Sicily, famed equally for its natural defences, and for the veneration the whole area received from having been trodden by Proserpina, who was abducted there. News of the tragic episode naturally spread throughout the island almost in a single day. People felt that by this unspeakable butchery, a dwelling of the gods, and not simply of men, had been violated, and with that, even those who had been vacillating earlier now went over to the Carthaginians. Hippocrates then withdrew to Mergantia, and Hamilcar to Agrigentum, for bringing the army to Henna at the invitation of the traders who proved a waste of time. Marcellus went back to Leontini, where he stockpiled grain and other provisions in the camp. He then left a small garrison in place and came to Syracuse to continue the siege. From Syracuse he sent Appius Claudius to Rome to stand for the consulship, and in his place he put Titus Quintius Crispinus in command of the fleet and the old camp. Marcellus himself constructed fortified winter quarters 5 miles from the Hexapylon at a place called Leon. Such were operations in Sicily up to the start of winter. '40. That same summer, the long-expected war with King Philip also broke out. Ambassadors came from Oricum to the praetor Marcus Valerius, who was standing guard with his fleet over Brundisium and the nearby Calabrian coastline. They informed Valerius that Philip had initially sailed upriver with 120 light biremes and had attacked Apollonia. However, when the operation dragged on longer than he had expected, Philip had, under cover of night, secretly moved his army to Oricum, and since the city stood on a plain and had no strength in terms of fortifications, manpower, or armaments, it had been taken at the first assault. As the ambassadors reported this, they begged Marcellus to bring them aid, and by land and sea operations, to keep a man who was undeniably an enemy of Rome away from the coastal towns, which were under attack for no other reason than that they faced Italy. Leaving behind a garrison of 2,000, which he put under the command of his legate, Publius Valerius, Marcus Valerius set off with his fleet drawn up and ready for action, and with the men for whom there was insufficient room on the warships boarded on freighters, he reached Oricum the next day. Holding the town was a feeble garrison that the king had left in place of his departure, and Valerius took it without much of a fight. Envoys from Apollonia came to the town bringing a report that their people were under siege because they refused to break with the Romans, and that they could no longer withstand the pressure being applied by the Macedonians unless they were sent Roman aid. Valerius promised to comply with their wishes and dispatched 2,000 elite troops to the river mouth in warships. The force was under the command of a prefect of the allies, Quintus Navius Christa, a man of energy and an experienced soldier. Christa set his men ashore and sent the ships back to rejoin the rest of the fleet at Oricum, his point of departure. Then, keeping his distance from the river, he led his men along a path that was little patrolled by the king's troops, and slipped into the city at night, unnoticed by any of the enemy. The following day the force remained inactive to give the prefect the time to review the men of fighting age in Apollonia, as well as the town's armaments and other strengths. An inspection and review of these gave Krista considerable reassurance, and at the same time he learned from his scouts the extent of the enemy's slackness and negligence. He therefore slipped noiselessly from the city at the dead of night, and made his way into the enemy camp. Security here was so slipshod and slack that it was reliably recorded that more than 1,000 men passed over the rampart before anyone became aware of it, and that, had they avoided bloodshed, they could have reached the king's tent. It was the killing of the Macedonians closest to the gate that awoke the enemy. With that, sheer panic and trepidation seized them all, so that no one else took up arms or tried to drive the foe from the camp. In addition, the king himself took to his heels in the most half-naked state in which he had been awakened from his sleep, and he fled to his ships on the river dressed in a manner that was unbecoming for a common soldier, much less a king. The other Macedonians poured out in a crowd after him. Slightly fewer than 3,000 men were either taken prisoner or cut down within the camp, but considerably more were taken prisoner than were killed. After the camp had been pillaged, the Apollonians hauled off to Apollonia catapults, ballistas, and other artillery that had been concentrated there to lay siege to the city. These they would use to defend their walls in the event of such a situation arising in future. All the other plunder from the camp was ceded to the Romans. When news of the action was brought to Oricum, Marcus Valerius immediately brought the fleet to the river mouth to prevent the king making good his escape by ship. And so Philip began to lose confidence in his ability to match his foe in battle, whether on land or sea. He beached and burned his ships, and then headed for Macedonia overland, his army for the most part stripped of its arms and belongings. The Roman fleet under Marcus Valerius' command wintered at Oricum. The same year's operations in Spain met with mixed success. Before the Romans could cross the river Ebro, Mago and Hasdrubal routed huge forces of the Spaniards. In fact, further Spain would have defected from Rome but for Publius Cornelius, who swiftly took his army across the Ebro and arrived in the nick of time when the allies were still wavering. The Romans first encamped at Castrum Album, which is famed as the spot where the great Hamilcar was killed. Here the citadel had been fortified, and they had stockpiled grain in advance. However, the surrounding areas were completely occupied by hostile forces, and a Roman column had been attacked by enemy cavalry without being able to retaliate. Some 2,000 of them had been killed when they failed to keep up or were scattered through the countryside. The Romans therefore withdrew to a location closer to more peaceful areas and established a fortified camp at Mount Victory. To this spot Gnaeus Scipio came with his entire force, and so too did Hasdrubal, son of Gisgo. He was now the third Carthaginian general, at the head of an army with its full quota of men. All three Carthaginian generals then took up a position across the river from the Roman camp. again. The previous year, when Metellus was quaestor, these men had deprived him of his horse, expelled him from his tribe, and degraded him to a poll tax paying class because of his participation in the conspiracy to abandon Italy that had been hatched at Cannae. However, the censors were aided by 9 of the tribunes, who ruled against their being tried while in office, and the men were released. They were prevented from performing the ceremony at the end of their term because Publius Furius died. Marcus Attilius resigned his office. The consular elections were presided over by the consul Quintus Fabius Maximus, and the men elected to the office, both of them in their absence, were Quintus Fabius Maximus, son of the consul, and Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, who was elected for the second time. 2 men who were curule aediles at the time, Publius Sempronius Tuditanus and Gnaeus Fulvius Centumalus, were elected praetors, along with Marcus Attilius and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. It is on record that this was the first year in which theatrical competitions lasting 4 days were staged by the curule aediles. The aedile Tuditanus was the man who, at Cannae, led his men through the middle of the enemy, when others, caught in the great disaster, were paralyzed with fear. The elections finished, the consuls elect were on a proposal made by the consul Quintus Fabius summoned to Rome, where they took up their office. They then consulted the Senate on the conduct of the war, on the assignment of areas of responsibility, their own and those of praetors, and on the armies to be employed and their commanders. 44. The distribution of responsibilities in armies was accordingly made as follows. The war with Hannibal was assigned to the consuls. They were to have 2 armies, one that had been under the command of Sempronius himself, the other under Fabius, the retiring consul. The armies comprised 2 legions each. The praetor Marcus Aemilius, who had drawn the foreigners' jurisdiction in the Sortition, was to have Luceria as his province, his judicial responsibilities being reassigned to his colleague Marcus Attilius, the urban praetor. Aemilius was to have the 2 legions which Quintus Fabius, who was now consul, had commanded as praetor. Publius Sempronius Tuditanus was allotted Ariminum as his responsibility. Publius Sempronius Tuditanus was allotted Ariminum as his responsibility. Gnaeus Fulvius Sisula. Each was to have 2 legions, Fulvius taking the urban legions and Tuditanus receiving those of Marcus Pomponius. Extensions of commands and responsibilities were given as follows. Marcus Claudius, Sicily within the confines of what was constituted the kingdom of Hiero, with Publius Lentulus taking over the old province as propraetor. Titus Otacilius, the fleet. There was no assignment of fresh troops for these 3 officers. Marcus Valerius, Greece and Macedonia, with the legion and fleet then under his command. Quintus Mucius, Sardinia, along with its former army, which comprised 2 legions. Gaius Terentius, Picenum, with the 1 legion that was already under his command. In addition, orders were issued for the mobilization of 2 city legions and 20,000 allies. Such were the commanders and forces with which the Romans, facing multiple wars at the same time, either in progress or thought to be coming, defending their empire. The consuls mobilized the two city legions and raised supplementary troops for other legions then before leaving the city. They saw to the expiation of prodigies that had been reported. The town wall and the gate had been struck by lightning at Caieta, as had the temple of Jupiter in Eresia. In addition, there were tricks played on eyes and ears that were accepted as real. There was the sighting of non-existent warships on the river at Terracina, the sounds of arms clashing in the temple of Jupiter Vasilinus in the area of Compsa, and the river at Amiternum running with blood. These portents were expiated in accordance with a decree of the pontiffs, and the consuls left Rome, Sempronius for Lucania, and Fabius for Apulia. Fabius the elder came to his son's encampment in Apulia to serve as his legate. The son went forward to meet him, and out of respect for the father's eminence, his lictors were silent as they went ahead of him. The old man had written past letters, 11 sets of fasces, when the consul told the lictor closest to him to pay attention. The lictor then jumped from his mount, saying, "My son, I wanted to see if you were fully aware that you are a consul." 45. Dacius Altinius, a native of Arpi, came to that camp furtively during the night with 3 slaves, and promised to betray Arpi for a price. When Fabius raised the matter with his consul, all except his father were for having the man flogged and put to death as a deserter. Altinius was a man of dubious loyalty, they said, and an enemy to both sides. After the debacle at Cannae, he had gone over to Hannibal and brought Arpi to defect for him, it seemed. Loyalty belonged only with success. Now, contrary to his hopes and wishes, the fortunes of Rome appeared to be radically changing and experiencing a virtual renaissance, and he was therefore undertaking to compensate those whom he had already betrayed with a new act of treachery. He was always standing on one side, with his sympathies on the other, a perfidious ally, an ineffectual enemy. He should join the men who betrayed the Falerii and Theorus as a third object lesson for deserters. The elder Fabius disagreed. Men, he said, are forgetting their own situation if, when war is raging hot about them, they give free rein to their ideas on any matter as if they were at peace. Instead, their actions and deliberations should have one goal, namely to prevent, if it can be done by any means, the defection from the Roman people of any of its allies. This, Fabius continued, they were not considering. They were saying instead that an example should be made of anyone coming to his senses and looking back wistfully on a formal alliance. If, however, one is allowed to abandon the Romans but not return to them, it was perfectly obvious that the Roman cause would soon entirely lose the support of its allies, and they would see everything in Italy unified under treaties with Carthage. Now, he was not a man who would advocate putting the slightest trust in Altinius, he said, but he would follow a strategy that represented a middle course. His opinion was that, for the moment, Altinius should be considered neither an enemy nor a friend. He should be held for the duration of the war in open custody, not far from the camp in some community loyal to them. The war over, they should then consider whether his earlier defection was more deserving of punishment than his present return was of pardon. Fabius won assent. Altinius himself was handed over to some officials from Calais. Along with his companions, and instructions were given for the large quantity of gold that he had brought with him to be held in safekeeping. At Calais he was at liberty all day, but guards attended him, and at night they kept him confined. At Arpi, it was in his home that Altinius' absence was first noticed, and a search for him was initiated. Then word of his disappearance spread through the city, causing the commotion one might expect at the loss of a leader, and fear of a coup prompted them to send off messengers to Hannibal at the double. The Carthaginian leader was by no means upset at the news. He too had long suspected Altinius to be a dubious loyalty, and he had now gained a pretext for confiscating and selling off the property of a man of considerable means. But to make people think he was motivated by anger rather than greed, he added to his avarice an act of cruelty as well. He summoned Altinius's wife and children to the camp, and interrogated them first about the man's flight, and then about the amount of gold and silver that had been left in his house. When he had satisfactory answers to all his questions, he burned them alive. (46) Leaving Sussula, Fabius proceeded first with an attack on Arpi. Encamping about a half-mile away, he took a close look at the lie of the city and its walls. He then decided to make his assault right at the point where it was best protected by the walls, because he saw that that was the spot least attentively guarded. He brought together all the equipment used for assaults on cities, and then picked out from his entire army the very best of his centurions, whom he put under the command of some courageous tribunes. He assigned to this group a force of 600 soldiers, enough, he thought, for the job in hand, and ordered them to carry ladders to the appropriate spot at the sound of the signal for the fourth watch. In that sector was a gate that was low and narrow. The road there was not much used, as it passed through a sparsely populated section of the city. Fabius ordered the men first to scale the wall with their ladders, and then open the gate from the inside, or break its bars. When they had secured that part of town, they were to give a signal on a bugle for the rest of the troops to move up. Fabius would have everything ready and prepared. The orders were briskly carried out, and what seemed likely to impede their effort proved of the greatest assistance in tricking the enemy. A rainstorm started at midnight, forcing the guards and sentries to slip away from their posts and run for shelter in the buildings. Then, because of the beating of the rain, which was heavier at first, the downpour also prevented the din of the men working on the gate from being heard. Later, as the defenders heard the rain falling more gently and steadily, it lulled most of them to sleep. Taking possession of the gate, the Romans ordered their trumpeters, placed at equal intervals along the street, to give the signal for calling the consul. This was done in the manner agreed upon. The consul ordered the advance, and shortly before daybreak he entered the city through the gate that had been forced open. (47) It was at this point that the enemy finally woke up. when the rain was tailing off and down, and dawn was near. Within the city, Hannibal had a garrison of about 5,000 soldiers, and the people of Arpi had themselves put 3,000 men under arms. It was the latter that the Carthaginians put in the front line to face the enemy, so that they would have no treachery behind them. The fighting started in the dark in the narrow streets. The Romans seized not only the streets, but the buildings next to the gate as well, to remove any possibility of their being targeted and wounded from the rooftops. Some of the inhabitants of Arpi and some Romans then recognized each other, and conversations started up between them. The Romans asked what the people of Arpi thought they were doing, what misdeed of the Romans or what benefit from the Carthaginians was leading them to wage war against their old Roman allies in support of foreigners and barbarians, and to turn Italy into a tax-paying subject of Africa. The excuse of the people of Arpi was that, unbeknownst to them, they had been sold out to the Carthaginians by their leaders, that they had been overpowered and oppressed by a handful of men. Once a start had been made, the conversations became more widespread, and eventually the chief magistrate of Arpi was brought before the consul by his compatriots. Amidst the standards and battle lines, assurances were given, and suddenly the citizens of Arpi turned their weapons on the Carthaginians, and fought for the Romans. The Spaniards, too, transferred their allegiance to the consul. They numbered slightly fewer than 1,000, and the pact they made with the consul promised no more than the release with impunity of the Punic garrison. The doors were open for the Carthaginians, who, released with a guarantee of safe conduct, came unharmed to Hannibal at Salapia. Arpi was then returned to the Romans without any loss of life, with the sole exception of a long-time trader who had recently deserted. Orders were issued for the Spaniards to be given double rations, and the Republic thereafter frequently made use of their courageous and loyal service. One of the consuls was in Apulia, and the other in Lucania, when the Campanian when 112 Campanian knights of noble birth left Capua with their magistrates' permission, ostensibly to take plunder from enemy territory. They came to the Roman camp above Susula. They gave their identity to the guards on duty and said they wanted a word with the praetor. The camp was under the command of Gnaeus Fulvius, who, when the message was brought to him, ordered 10 of the group to be brought to him unarmed. On hearing their request, they sought nothing more than the return of their property when Capua was retaken. He accepted them all under his protection. The town of Atrinum was stormed by the other praetor, Sempronius Tuditanus, with more than 7,000 prisoners taken, along with a quantity of bronze and silver coin. At Rome, there was a terrible fire that went on for 2 nights and a day. Everything between the Salinae and Porta Carmentalis was razed to the ground, including the Aquidmalium, the Vicus Eugarius, and the temples of Fortuna and Mater Matuta. The fire also spread outside the gate, destroying many buildings, religious and secular. '48. Since things were going well in Spain, and they were enlisting new allies as well as recovering many of the old ones, Publius and Gnaeus Cornelius that same year expanded their ambitions to include Africa as well. The Numidian king Sphax had been suddenly turned into an enemy of the Carthaginians, and to him the Cornelii sent a delegation of 3 centurions. These were to conclude a treaty of friendship with the king and promise the gratitude of the Senate and people of Rome if he continued to put military pressure on the Carthaginians, adding that the Romans would, at the appropriate moment, discharge their obligation to him with handsome interest. The barbarian was delighted with the delegation, and he discussed tactics for the war with the delegates. But when he listened to the words of these seasoned fighters and compared their well-disciplined organization with his own, he realized just how much he did not know. His first request of them, as good and loyal allies, was for 2 of the centurions to carry back to their commanders the results of their mission, while one remained behind as his instructor in military matters. The Numidian people, he explained, had no experience in infantry fighting, their expertise being confined to horses. This was how his ancestors had conducted their wars since the earliest days of their nation. He said, and it was in this that his people had been trained from childhood. But Sphax added he had an enemy who relied on fighting on foot, and if he wanted to be that man's equal in military strength, he too had to acquire infantry. In fact, his kingdom had a large population well suited for that, but he had no idea how to arm, equip, and train it. In fact, it was a complete and utter shambles, and a randomly assembled crowd of people, like a randomly assembled, In fact, it was a complete and utter shambles, like a randomly assembled crowd of people, he said. The delegates replied that they would do what he wanted for the time being, on condition that he solemnly undertook to send the man back immediately, if their commanders did not give approval to their action. The man who remained at the king's court was called Quintus Statorius. The king selected and sent a number of Numidians to Spain along with 2 Romans. These were to act as his representatives and gain approval for the treaty from the Roman commanders. But he also instructed them to lose no time in exciting the Numidian auxiliaries who were serving with the Carthaginian troops to desert. Meanwhile, Statorius conscripted an infantry force for the king from amongst the large numbers of Numidian men of fighting age. He formed them up pretty well after the Roman manner, and by putting them through maneuvers and military drill, taught them to follow their standards and keep their ranks. He also familiarized them with siege work. He formed them up pretty well after the Roman manner, and by putting them through maneuvers and military drill, taught them to follow their standards and keep their ranks. He also familiarized them with siege work, construction, and other regular duties of the soldier. So thorough was he that in a short while the king had no greater confidence in his cavalry than he did in his infantry, and in an engagement fought on level ground he defeated the Carthaginian enemy in pitched battle. Moreover, the Romans in Spain derived great benefit from the arrival of the king's representatives. At the news of their coming, cases of desertion by the Numidians began to be commonplace. So began the friendly relations of the Romans with Sphax. When the Carthaginians learned of it, they immediately sent a delegation to Galla, who was king in another area of Numidia. His people are called the Masuli. 49. Galla had a son, Massinissa. He was only 17 years old, but was a young man of such qualities that it was already apparent that he was going to make the kingdom greater and richer than what he inherited. The Carthaginian delegates explained that Sphax had joined the Romans to strengthen himself by that alliance against the kings and peoples of Africa. It would also be better for Galla to join the Carthaginians as soon as possible, they said, before Sphax crossed to Spain, or the Romans to Africa. Sphax could be caught off guard before he had derived anything more than nominal benefit from the alliance. Persuading Galla to send any army was easy, since his son insisted on the war, and when Massinissa joined up with the Carthaginian legions, he defeated Sphax in a great battle. In that battle, it is said, 30,000 men were killed. Sphax fled the field with a few horsemen, and came to the Maurusian Numidians, who live near the ocean in the far reaches of the country, opposite Gades. At the news of his arrival, barbarians flocked to him from all quarters, enabling him in a short time to put under arms huge forces with which he intended to cross to Spain, separated from him by only a narrow strait. But Massinissa then arrived with his triumphant army, and there, on his own and without any assistance from the Carthaginians, he covered himself with fame, fighting a war with Sphax. There were no notable events in Spain apart from the Roman commander's success in enticing the young Celtiberian soldiers to their side, with the same level of pay these had settled on with the Carthaginians. The Romans also sent more than 300 Spaniards of the highest rank to Italy, to encourage disaffection amongst their countrymen who were serving in the auxiliary troops of Hannibal. This is all that is worth recording in Spain for that year. Its significance lies in the fact that prior to the hiring of the Celtiberians at that time, the Romans had never had mercenary soldiers in their service. End of Book 24.